Okay, so remember Weber's trying to explain the rise of this new form of capitalism, this ideal type that he structures around, that he calls rational capitalism. So where does rational capitalism come from? That's the key question of the book. And he's going to root this in a new form of religion and religiosity in Protestantism. Right? So he's going to root this in the particular form of Protestant theology that takes root within the West. So the key historical moment then is going to be for him the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is a historical schism within the Christian church, which we now call the Catholic Church in the West. So in 1517, a guy named Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses, which are arguments against basically the way in which the Catholic Church is developed by his point in time. And this moment then leads to a set of Protestant sects that emerge as a sort of distinctive form of religiosity from Catholicism. And there's a whole set of reasons why the Protestant Reformation happens that we won't get into. The key thing for us is that this new religious form takes place. Now, a key question is, well, what is the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism? Both of them are what we often refer to as salvation religions. That is, the key element of them is that there's an attempt to get into a better afterlife. What we often come in the religion is called heaven. The goal is to get to this better afterlife, and most especially to avoid being sort of cast into hell. That is, the point is to be saved from eternal damnation. But what's critical is the distinctive ways in which this takes place within the religion. So in Catholicism, you have this large kind of church institution that mediates your relationship with God, and it mediates your salvation then. So you confess your sins to a priest. The priest then tells you, okay, say some Hail Marys and sin no more. So the whole salvation is mediated through the church. Protestant sects have no standing church to mediate their relationship to God and to mediate their salvation. And so your salvation importantly becomes a question mark, and it becomes something that has to be grappled with and dealt with as an individual, a problem that you as an individual have to solve, not that you can sort of mediate through a church. And the particular way in which Protestants come to ensure their salvation, Weber is going to argue, is or convince themselves really of their salvation, is the thing that generates this new form of rational capitalism. So what he does in the book is to lay out a Protestant ideal type. There are three basic components to it: the calling, predestination, and worldly asceticism that form this ideal type. And he's going to basically link this ideal type of Protestantism with the ideal type of rational capitalism to make sense of how Protestantism produces this new economic system. So what I'm going to do is to walk through each of these three pieces of the ideal type to help us make sense of them, and then in a future video we'll sort of pull all of them together. So the bulk of this video is going to be centered on understanding this ideal type of Protestantism. The first component comes from that guy that wrote the 95 Theses, Martin Luther. And it's what in German is written by Weber as Beruf, but is translated as the calling. And so it's a central piece of this. So what is the calling? The calling is essentially a religious task or duty that's set by God. It's something that God kind of commands you to do. It's a duty you have, and you must sort of fulfill this duty in this life. Right, and you must pursue it with a maximum kind of effort. So the real thing Weber's doing here is linking one's occupation to a higher task or higher order set by God in the calling. We might call this now a vocation. Right, so it links what you're doing in this life to back to God and to pursuing this towards the glory of God. What's really critical here, that is to say, why the calling matters, is that it begins for Protestants to justify a real intense engagement in worldly affairs. Right, a key part of Catholicism was detaching oneself from worldly affairs. And sort of setting yourself apart in that way from the world. What the calling is going to do is to take Protestants and kind of push them towards an intense engagement with worldly matters. And you engage through worldly matters through your calling. And this, Weber argues, is something that only exists within Protestantism. And that'll be ends up being a key contentious point, though. So he writes in the Protestant Ethic, the only way of living acceptably to God was not to surpass worldly morality in monastic asceticism, but solely through the fulfillment of the obligations imposed upon the individual by his position in the world. That was his calling. So God put you in a particular position, and your job was to fulfill that position to the best of your capabilities. All right, so that's the calling. Predestination. What is predestination? Predestination is rooted in this guy, John Calvin, and so it's going to be something that is linked to Calvinism as a particular form of Protestantism. But it's a particular theological claim that Calvin makes, that the whole world is set into motion by God. And God has basically set the world into motion and then steps away from it. And what the implication of that is that God has preordained everything that is going to happen, and that means he has preordained your future and preordained who's going to be in heaven. So individual salvation now, Calvin argues, is a preordained, a predetermined phenomenon, right? And he has this notion of the elect to make sense of that, that God has preordained some set of people to be a part of the elect. Those who are preordained to be saved and to go to heaven are members of the elect, right? So you're either damned to hell or you're saved and you go on to live in heaven. But there's nothing you can actually do to change that. And that's the distinctive thing. This has been preordained, predetermined by God. So some people are in the elect and others are not. You can't work your way into the elect. You don't become elect. You either are elect or you are not. So what does this mean for Calvin's followers? The key question they have to grapple with their entire life is, am I a member of the elect? Am I chosen by God? And so you have to figure out and work through determining if you're a member of elect. Again, you're not making yourself a part of the elect. Your whole life's work is to determine if you're a part of the elect. This becomes known as the doctrine of proof. And again, it is the central problem for Protestants according to Durkheim. What does this then mean? Well, Calvin knows he's going to be going to heaven. He knows he's in the elect because he discovered this theology, right? But how does the everyday Calvinist actually do this? They have to convince themselves and convince others around them that they are a member of the elect. And one key way Weber argues they do this is they transform their everyday activities through the calling. So now we're linking the calling to predestination. They have to convince themselves of this, and a key way they come to do this is to transform their everyday activities by vigorously working in their calling, that duty set upon them by God, and this will provide evidence to them and to others that they are members of the elect. You should note, Weber saw this doctrine as extremely inhumane. So he writes in the Protestant Ethic, in its extreme inhumanity, this doctrine, that is the doctrine of proof, must above all have had one consequence for the life of a generation which surrendered to its magnificent consistency. That was a feeling of unprecedented inner loneliness of the single individual. You are isolated, basically, Weber is arguing, in working out your own salvation. Okay, so that's predestination. What about the last component, worldly asceticism? First of all, let's get our heads wrapped around what asceticism itself is. Asceticism could be best understood as a kind of consistent and systematic self-denial. This focus on controlling one's own behaviors to avoid the kind of pleasures of life, to avoid what in Christian circles is often called the temptations of the flesh, right? These things are meant to be sort of controlled, and you're sort of set to deny yourself these particular things, right? But what's important is there's a distinctive way in which asceticism plays out in Protestantism. So the highest sort of level of asceticism inside of Catholicism is monastic asceticism. Monks go and move themselves away from the world, and that's a key distinction, go away from the world and live inside of monasteries where they devote themselves to understanding the Bible and devote themselves to God. By removing themselves from the world, right, and putting themselves into the monastery. It's very different in Protestantism because there is no monastery, there is no formalized church and church hierarchy into which one can engage in a kind of active asceticism. So this has to be done in one's everyday life. And this is a kind of classic picture of Puritans in New England, right? But it exemplifies what Protestant asceticism looks like. If you look at these individuals, they are dressed very simply. They live in a simple house with a farm. They engage in their calling on a day in and day out basis. But they don't use that to then buy bigger mansions and sort of transform themselves. In modern day worlds, we would talk about, right, buying fancy cars and jewelry and bigger houses. No, they deny themselves those things and focus in especially on their calling. So what has to happen then for Protestants is they have to engage in self-denial and self-control in their everyday life. They don't remove themselves into the monastery. The highest form of asceticism is self-control in one's everyday life. So Weber writes, impulsive enjoyment of life, which leads away both from work and a calling and from religion, was as such the enemy of rational asceticism, whether in the form of seigneurial sports or the enjoyment of the dance hall or the public house or of the common man. Right? So the key thing here is to give up, deny oneself in your everyday activities. Lead a simple life, devoid of these worldly pleasures, and disciplined by your calling. Okay, so those are the basic elements of the Protestant ideal type as Weber lays it out, and in the next video we will look into how exactly he puts all of this ideal type together to make sense of the rise of rational capitalism.